when I was in Colorado this year, elk hunting is a tough one for me because elk hunting is expensive. I mean, the tag's expensive. It's a haul. It's hotel rooms, getting out there and back. I don't have tons of elk gear, so I bought a lot of crap for this trip.
Oh yeah.
And like I'm just like I was hiking out there, and I had hit a point probably on about day 5 when we switched gears, moved to a new spot, and that spot didn't seem to have anything in it. I kind of had resigned myself, like, okay, I'm going to eat this tag. And I was thinking about it, just hiking, where I'm like, is elk hunting worth it for me? Because like I want to do it so bad. But when you start factoring in, like, this is part of your business and the odds are so low, it's expensive, it's out of your comfort zone, it's a long time away from home. And I realized we had this, this is going to sound dumb, but we had this day, I talked about it with Tyler Pierce, my hunting buddy, where we put on almost 13 miles. We never heard an elk. We never saw an elk. We never jumped an elk. The biggest thing we saw was squirrels and those gray jays, those camp robbers,
Yeah. Yeah.
And we had this moment just climbing up this trail, and I had kind of resigned myself. I'm like, this ain't going to happen. And these gray jays flew in, and they were landing right next to us and flying up to us like they were going to land in your hand, Like, I think if we'd have had some granola or something, they'd have landed in our hand. And it was like this 10-minute experience where I was like, that was so freaking cool. And it was just dumb, right? Like, I mean, you're just messing with some wild birds who are looking for looking for a handout. And I remember thinking, like, yeah, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this every year till they kick me out. Because just, the experience is so great. And then I've had this happen a few times on my trips where I've been like, I know this isn't going to happen anymore. I'm on like my last afternoon, just not going to happen. And I hit this place where I'm just like totally content with it. And then bam, I kill. Like I've had it happen a couple different times, and I'm always hyper aware of it because when you're like, I'm done,
Oh yeah. Well, I think for both of us, you and I both started elk hunting again. You might have got one in before I did, but about 3 years ago, let's say it. I think we've both been on 3 hunts or 4 hunts, and I think I've kind of, to your point, this year I was on the side of the mountain. I'm climbing. We had a rough day. We'd gone a lot of miles, weren't getting any bull to sound off whatsoever. And you're starting to look at now a map of all the over-the-counter states and national forests and BLM, and you go, where do I go? Like, what am I going to do now? And you're going, we probably have forgotten about it, but we went through kind of that same kind of curve within our whitetail hunting, I guess, life, and you could call it, or process. And it's that point of you starting to realize that one week a year is probably not going to cut it unless you're paying somebody to put you on them, or paying somebody to guide you into where it's 7 days of a learning experience. And, both of us having the addictive personality and the competitive personality that we do that comes along with our passion here in the outdoors, you just kind of hit that unfortunate moment of, gosh, I'm going through all this work. I'm putting in what I feel like is a ton of effort, and I'm just not getting the outcome that I expect, but also realizing that you're going to have to work harder, or you're going to have to work longer, or you're going to have to be out there more days or take another trip. And the reality is setting in on that trip that it's probably not going to happen. But to your point, you never know. It could be the next 5 minutes. I told you the first 30 minutes that we hunted after we hiked 5 miles in that first day out there and got our camp set up, went up the ridge into a saddle, and it was a place I'd pre-scouted out. It was just on the south side of a steep north-facing slope of dark timber, and it's just a little saddle. And it seemed like, if elk were going to come up off that north face of timber, they were going to come right through that saddle, that low point in between mountains or ridges. And we walked 300 yards from our camp, got up there. There were elk beds. You could smell them like they'd just been there. I looked to my cousin and said, well, let's set up with the wind right. You guys get downwind from me about 7,500 yards and we'll call. And we weren't 5 minutes into the calling sequence and we called up our first elk. Boom. There it was. We didn't get a shot, but just like that. And I never would have expected for it to happen like that. So you don't know how quick it can happen or when it's going to happen, but you have to be prepared for it. So
when you come from where we come from and you call in the first elk, it's like seeing like Bigfoot ride a unicorn into your living room. It's like, this is not,
it's not real.
No, it's amazing. And it's such a freaking confidence boost. Like
It is.
it does psychologically. It is so important to even when you don't arrow one, to just
Yep.
see that it's possible.
Yep. Yep. No, just seeing that elk come in, and we ended up calling in multiple bulls, and we had one missed shot, and just it seemed like we had 3 that came in on us all at once, and they were 15 yards from my cousins, and I could see them in broad view, and I was just waiting for him to fling an arrow, and we had 2 or 3 come in full frontals up to about 30 yards and just never got that broadside shot on them. But at the end of the day, like I came home and I think I told you I went into that trip with the mindset that I was going to call until the opportunity was presented to, my cousins. They don't necessarily have the opportunity I do in regards to the amount of hunting that they do in a fall. And I knew an elk to them would mean a little bit more than it would. It's going to mean a lot. Don't take that in the wrong way. It's going to mean a lot to me, but I just want to put them in the position to try to succeed first. So I went into it calling, and I felt like, even though we didn't arrow a bull, but to know that, we called in that many bulls and saw that many elk and learned that much more, it was 100% a success. And that's not even, a cliche statement of, oh, well, I didn't fill my tag, but yeah, it worked out pretty good. It was a great experience, and I'm already looking forward to going back. So can't wait. Can't wait.
It's so worth it. And I think, Tyler and I had this conversation when we were out there sitting on the side of a mountain. I really think that experience in the elk mountains versus experience in the whitetail woods, private versus public, and then you turkey hunt and you get all this stuff in. I think all of it feeds into the same thing. Like I think to be a better hunter, the more stuff like that you do, because there's so many parallels. And I know some Western elk hunters would think there's nothing similar between a whitetail and an elk, and that's wrong. If you hunt public land whitetails and you hunt public land elk, there's a lot of parallels there.
Right.
One is just on a lot larger scale. But I think that's why I've always, we've bumped into the same people in the industry for a long time. And some of them are just like, I hunt whitetails on this farm these days, and that's all I do. And I'm like, well, other than being good at hunting whitetails on that farm, how could you possibly be a good hunter if you don't go do any of this other stuff?
Yeah. And I think that some of them, that's what they're used to, and it's just been successful for them. I think it's kind of like, I would say probably like a baseball player, Major League Baseball player, getting to the league because he hits triples all day long, and he all of a sudden gets a batting coach that says, yeah, but you can hit home runs if you change your swing in this fashion, and they just don't know any better, at that point in time. But you're right. I can 100% agree with your statement there, and the fact that just from personal experience over the last 3 years, I've been afforded more time. Even though I've worked in the industry for 12 years, I've not worked on this side of it. And I've been afforded more time in the last 3 years to be out in the woods to an extent or to a level at which I can now start to notice things and build that database, whether it's hunting turkey or hunting elk or hunting whitetail. And you, to your point, start to build those parallels, even to the extent that I'm documenting things where I hunted for almost 20 years. Bow hunted for almost 20 years before I came to work at OSG or at Bowhunter magazine. And I had killed several Pope and Young deer, felt like a pretty decent bow hunter, whitetail hunter. Knew I wasn't the best out there by any means, nowhere near that good, but felt like I had a pretty good idea, but it was all pretty limited to the farm that I had grown up on, that 900 acres in Northeast Missouri and maybe a few other places here and there, a few pieces of public ground in our area, but it was all pretty limited to that. And what I noticed as I started getting out and hunting other states and hunting other types of property is that I started to pay more attention to what a deer was browsing on, where these trails were coming from and what they were going to. The type of terrain that trail may have existed in, or the type of terrain that those deer were on their feet in during daylight hours, where in the past I just knew that, hey, I got this one tree, it's on a pinch point, or it's in the corner of the bean field, or it's right along this bedding area. I know that if I can be in that tree, for 3 of the 7 days in this time period, I got a pretty good chance of at least seeing a deer, and what I really learned was the difference between putting yourself in a place where you can view deer and putting yourself in a place where you can harvest deer. And I did a lot of viewing deer for the first 10 to 15 years of my bow hunting career. But I would say that, and it could all change. I could, lose a good chunk of my game going into next year for some reason. And it may just have one of those tough years where it doesn't work. And I would argue that that was my year last year, by the way. So I'm kind of hoping to stay away from
we're
that.
going to talk about that. But before we do, I want to just touch on that point you just made about observation or setting up to see deer versus setting up to kill them. Cause I preach this a lot, and my buddies who sit in my tree stands hate it because
Yeah.
it's a lot of times it's very tight. You mentioned staging areas earlier. And I think it's a common problem. It's a human nature thing where you see it in the gun world a lot. Like if you're a firearms hunter for deer, you want to sit on that power line or you want to sit on that clear cut and see all the way across it, reach out and touch them with your 300 Win Mag. But those deer, after it doesn't take very long of crossing wide open spaces and getting shot at before they're like, well, I know where I'm going. It's not in the wide open. Bow hunters are wired the same way. And it's like, man, if you give them a field to sit on, and I think this is the biggest problem I run into with people who have grown up and had success where they have nice ag to sit on. If they go try to hunt public land, that nice ag to sit on that might exist on public land has everybody sitting on it. And those deer, it just changes, and you learn. You have to like retrain yourself that the destination food source might not be the answer to your deer hunting problems, and it's a hard thing for a lot of people to get over.
It is. It's hard. And I think a lot of it comes down, especially going into new places, the fear of the unknown. Like you're going into a new spot. You've never put a stand on it before, or maybe you've only hunted the north side of it. And you haven't hunted the other 75% of that piece of public ground or new ground. And, it's always that fear of unknown, especially when you're on a limited time frame. If you're there for only 5 days versus, 7 or having a whole season to hunt, like you might be at home. You're afraid to put yourself back in a spot where you can only see 50 yards. And, the only deer you're going to see is the deer that you're going to shoot. And it's a hard, in Wyoming, we pretty much did that. That little pinch point was right where those oak flats kind of had 100-yard, I would say more or less funnel where the oak timber got as close to those breaks as it did anywhere for 3 or 4 miles. They would come into that area. The trouble was for me to hunt that efficiently, I had to be on the downside of those breaks. So I was sitting literally a foot over my head was the top of that break where I could have seen that whole oak flat and kind of watch deer come at us. But instead we were tucked down in there and we were waiting for them to pop up on us last second, and I'm not going to lie, we were on the ground. I might have snuck up and taken a few peeks when it got slow at times, but it's the adventurous side of my soul, my mental. That's a hard part to mentally overcome, but it is. It's tough. If I'd been stuck in a tree stand and not had that opportunity, it would have killed me to have to sit there 4 days or 3 days, evenings, whatever. We end up sitting there and not been able to see over that ridge and see what's coming. But I've learned, like I said, specifically the last 3 years that your best spots are usually those kind of spots, and or can be in a lot of places. And that's another thing that's hard to overcome. You got to be okay with only seeing 2 or 3 deer from that spot, but knowing that in regards to the statistics of the situation, that's going to put you in the best place statistically to harvest that deer that you're after. So, or just to make that shot,
Well, yeah, for sure. And that's a hard thing to get used to, is just having to make do with whatever's in the area. And that means the lightweight portable stands, you got the blinds, a natural blind. If you're comfortable with all those options, you can hunt more places. You have more options. Right. And if you go in and you're like, I'm only using a climber, well, then you only have the option of hunting climber stand friendly trees. Yeah. And there are places for it for sure, but it's really about making spots work regardless of what kind of ambush option they give you. And that is really the case when you travel and you give yourself 4 or 5 days on a public land whitetail. It's like, I find myself doing stuff where I'm like, this is so dumb, but it's the only option.
It's the only way.
And I kill deer doing stuff like that quite a bit. Like, it's not, not every time, but it's just being open to, you're not going to have the perfect setup. And this is, again, like if you grew up on a farm and you had, all summer to set up stands and cut shooting lanes and stuff, you're used to sort of that, like contrived situation that you've made for yourself. And that's awesome. If you have that, you're not going to have that when you go out on public land. Like you're going to have to settle for less.
Yep. Yeah. You're exactly right. I can think of, specifically again, just referencing back to that most recent trip, the setup in which I had the closest opportunity, the 2 nights that the deer just magically managed to hit our spot 8 minutes and 10 minutes after shooting time, within 30 yards. We were tucked up in between 3 or 4 sage bushes on the edge of a flat piece of ground in between that oak flat and the breaks. And that's all we had to hide in. And that was natural enough and close enough to get us into where those suckers were dropping in over those breaks. And both nights they popped right in. The one night they kind of like, that guy looks a little too brown to be a sagebush, but it still worked and it put us in position. It was just 8 minutes too late. So, but yeah, you're right. You have to get comfortable with that, and that's a tough thing to do. To sit there and know that I'm a little bit exposed. And you'd be surprised. If Yeah, and I actually, not to give you any credit, but I learned this from you. Like, I came from, a situation where, hey, like I'm not drawing my bow until I know for sure that deer's, quartering away and he's got his head tucked back into his belly on his other side licking, and he's going to have no way of seeing that I'm drawing. And I've had to learn over the last 3 years, especially in these public land hunting situations, when you get the chance to draw, you draw, and you'd be surprised, and not every deer is going to stand there and say, shoot me. But at the same time, you'd be surprised what you get away with in the 10 or 15 seconds that you have to settle in and let that arrow ride. So it's been a learning experience for me as well. It kind of goes along with the idea of being accepting of sitting in a position where you might not be comfortable sitting in at home,
Yeah. So. That when to draw thing, I don't know, man. Tyler and I talked about this out in Colorado, and I'm to the point now. I don't like to MERP to stop deer. I don't like to stop them. If I can avoid it, I will. And my kind of de facto way to do that, I'm like, when that deer gets to where I want to kill it, I just draw and kill it. And what happens a lot is they bust me and they just stop. They either hear it and they stop, or they hear it and they stop and they look up. Doesn't matter. Like at that point, if I'm drawn and you're standing there 20 yards away, it's not.
Chances are it's game over. Yeah.
And so it's used to be earlier in my career, if I draw on a deer and it busted me, then I'm falling apart, because now it's like, okay, it's going to run away. They're not like that. I have had deer, they'll hear that and they'll booger, but it's like really uncommon. And then usually they're really close, and then they booger out another 20 yards and you thump them anyway. Yep. And so that's like an experience thing where you just realize, like, they're not going to turn inside out just because they hear that little arrow scrape or hear your, like they hear you come to full draw. And if you come to full draw on them, they're in trouble.
Yep. Yeah. No, I to that specific point, I hunted Montana last year. I hunted some publicly accessible ground, and I may or may have not missed the deer 3 times in total. And 2 of those times was, I will say that the second situation in which I had an opportunity to shoot that deer was a couple nights after the first one. And he stepped out, and it was a longer shot, and I decided it was the right thing to do. And I did, and his head popped, and I let that arrow ride. And I'll tell you what, a mature deer on publicly accessible ground that I later found out tends to get pounded come rifle season. After talking to the local ranch owner there, MERT is probably not the best idea in regards to getting them to stop. And I to that point had never had a whitetail duck my arrow. I hadn't. And like I said, I hunt Northeast Missouri private ground. I grew up hunting that way. There's not a whole lot of pressure where I hunt, unless I've already managed to spook that deer a time or two myself. But I let the first arrow go, and he completely ducked it. And I was like, I just couldn't believe I didn't know what happened, was trying to figure it out. And so he ran back into the ditch and turned around, came back out, and gave me another shot at about the same exact distance. And I let it go again, and I watched that arrow go right over the top of him. And I looked at the cameraman in disbelief, because I'd never had that happen to me. And I said, I don't know what happened. And he just tapped me on the shoulder. And the whole story of, we'd put 5-6 days into this. We'd been closing in on this deer the whole time. I'd already had a situation where I bumped my release and sent an arrow over his back. And the first experience I had with him, or the first encounter I had with him, and I was already trying to deal with that mentally. And the fun games you play as a bow hunter, it was making for an awesome episode. I can tell you that. it still made for an awesome episode. We actually aired that here this quarter on Whitetail TV, so it was cool, man. But it's all part of the process, and you learn, and that's I can bet, I hate to speak for you, but for both of us, that's what bow hunting is, man. It's an adventure.